Hello and welcome to the Rating Room podcast. It's Jay and Andy again.
We're recording another special episode today. All the way from Finland, please welcome Arttu. Arttu, great to have you on the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm Arttu from Finland, and I'm, as many of my friends would tell, a massive Bond fan, and I've been that for many years, at least 15 years now. And when I'm not being a Bond fan or a movie fan in general, I work in film industry, usually location management and assistant direction. So my work life and recreational life is very film oriented, and Bond is a very treasured part of that.
That's great. And it'd be interesting to see what your responses are to our questions in terms of having that film background as well. So continue with the theme of James Bond. Let's get straight into the questions. So Arttu, what's your earliest Bond memory?
Well, yeah, I usually have few different answers to this, and one of them is the what you're asking, and the other one is the more interesting one. So I'm not quite sure what my earliest Bond memory actually is. It's one of those things that it's a series that has existed for so long that it's kind of like those osmosis things. You're um, kind of like subjugated by it pretty much right when you're out of the womb. You just don't know it yet. Um, but I think my earliest memory regarding Bond films was maybe, I would guess, and this is just my estimation, around the year 2000 when Tomorrow Never Dies came from television for the first time, because back then, like it was, there was a 3 year gap between theatrical release and a television release. So in the year 2000, Tomorrow Never Dies had like its television premiere here in Finland, and I watched like parts of it, and I was very fascinated by the film and whatnot. But my mom was very kind of protective of my viewing habits, and the film, while it's not necessarily the most violent of the films, it does include scenes of like man falling into a printer, like a newspaper printer, and there's like bloody paper running around, and Bond psychopathically saying they'll print anything these days, or like the main villain getting crushed by his own drill and whatnot. So the I was a little bit disturbed by that, and I think my mom was even more disturbed by that. And in connection to that film, I would say my first kind of like longer standing Bond memory was regarding the Tomorrow Never Dies video game for PlayStation 1, which was my first video game that I had on PlayStation. And only thing that I can remember from those days is that it was during a time where I still didn't have any video game literacy, so I had very hard time getting past the first level, or even the first area of the first level, because I didn't understand how buttons work. So that was my first memories, and then it just like came and went back and forth for years. Like I was like a Marvel. I liked like superheroes. I like Marvel things and Star Wars and whatnot. And Bond was just like among the pantheon of entertainment that I consumed, but just like one small part of it. And during the around like 2002 or whatnot, it was during the 40th anniversary of Bond films. The local channel 3, MTV3 here in Finland, had like a Bond November where they showed films from the Bond series every weekend, and with the idea that like people voted what films they wanted to see. So I think the first wing had Octopussy, the second one had Goldeneye, the third one had Tomorrow Never Dies, which was the number one winner, and then there was the television premiere of World Is Not Enough. And then there was kind of like this competition that if you entered, you could get tickets to Royal Albert Hall premiere of Die Another Day. But during that time, I saw Doctor No for the first time. Didn't like it. It was boring and dry and terrible. But then I saw like Man with the Golden Gun and whatnot. But then years went by, and Bond was kind of like this thing in osmosis where I didn't have that much of an opinion of it, but I had a very clear idea of it in terms of what Bond for me was, and it was Pierce Brosnan. It was the kind of like the high octane adventures of the 90s and early 2000s. So then in 2005, I remember it very clearly. It was around like October 2005, which was like a fall holiday here in Finland. That was when I became interested in Bond again, because that was during that time Daniel Craig was introduced as the new James Bond after these few years of hiatus that had taken place. And like everyone else, I had like a massive kind of like revolting reaction, revolted reaction to it because it didn't feel right. It felt he didn't feel like the choice that like anyone was pleased with at that time. And also the idea like it's going to be darker and more violent, and the premise was about poker games and whatnot. I thought like that's like the dullest dullest shit I've ever heard. So I kind of retreated back to the Brosnan films and I watched those and whatnot. But then the first trailer came out of Casino Royale, and I was immediately hooked. It was something about the trailer, the first teaser trailer that I saw, like, okay, this is what they're trying to do. It was one of those things where you are given something that you know that you always wanted, but you didn't. But didn't know that you wanted. Like until that point, Bond was to me like a fantastical nonsense, entertaining but fantastical nonsense. Casino Royale was the film that kind of felt like it felt more tangible, felt more real. So I started like really hyping up that film about like was it like 6 months beforehand. I had my Samsung flip phone. I put on my punched in the date of like I had like a alarm saying that like on 24th of November 2006 it's going to be a premiere of this film. Like it was a week after the American premiere, which I think was November 17th. So I was like hyping up. The Chris Cornell song came. I loved it. The real trailer came out. I loved that, and I was trying to make sure that any way that I could get there, get to see that film, and like I had like this little hurdle, which was that I was 13 years old at that time, and the film was age restricted to 15, and so I didn't have I didn't have admission rights to see that film. So I had to beg my half sister, who was much older than me, to come to see it with me because I didn't have any 15 and up friends, and my mom didn't want to see it, and dad. I don't think I even asked my dad. So there were all those things, and and then the hype train was coming. I was like so excited to see the film, and everything was laid out. And then the November 23rd of 2006 came, and then something happened in my banal existence that kind of have always tinged the way I see that film. On November 23rd, 2006, was a regular school day, and the school day had ended with a PE class. And what we were doing, we were on a local swimming center and doing the swimming classes and whatnot. And it was the cold, dark, gray, rainy day in a very small town in Finland. Like I'm not sure, like if or like might be like a British equivalent to the idea of like imagine like a town of like 30,000 people, like up north or something like that. And when doing like the rainy kind of like early winter and whatnot, and the PE class ended and I started walking and I have no idea what kind of blackout I had at that time, but then I realized that I had lost my school bag. Now, and I wasn't a very organized student, so I always carried everything I have in that bag, all the school books, all the notebooks and whatnot. So which meant that when I lose that, I will lose any kind of school related stuff I had. I tried to find it. I even called my teacher, like, did you see it? And he said that he didn't remember. So I went back to the swim center. I didn't find it there. So I went back to my school, even though I knew it wouldn't be there. And I was just like really anxious. And like this is a very kind of banal and small kind of drama, but you have to remember I was 13. Anyone who was 13 and lost their school back in this fashion would be kind of anxious about that. So eventually I went home and I told my mom, but I wouldn't dare to tell my dad, like he would rip my head off if he found out that what kind of irresponsible thing I had done. So I was trying to calm myself, and I went to sleep and woke up very early in the next morning, like relatively early. Meaning like I woke up like 6 in the morning, and went to school like hour earlier, around 7, to look for it again, and it wasn't there. And the school day started, and I literally had nothing on me. I didn't have any books, I didn't have any notepads, I didn't have any pencils and whatnot. So I had to kind of like in this pathetic or like embarrassing fashion, I had to just like piggyback of my friends all through the whole class of like just reading from their books, and then they and my teacher and lending their pens, and then like my teacher just like giving me like A4 paper from the printer to write down, and just like crushing them, putting it in my pockets. It was a nightmare. And around like during the midday after the lunch break, I wanted to take my mind off the situation. I did some like soccer playing, football playing in the classroom, and I think I slipped and fell into like a puddle and like got myself wet, and it was kind of like I was so tired and so anxious. And this was also during a time when a girl that I really liked had started dating one of my friends. I was just like love lost, kind of like in the a love lost boy in the grips of puberty, trying to kind of like just to get my mind, kind of my pick my mind up. And but luckily the day was quite short, and I went back again to the swimming center to see like what if it was still there. I just tried if it was still there. During that time, the flip phone told me that the film premiere is today, and I was like, okay, I don't. I can't think of that. I'd been waiting for that day for 6 months, and I couldn't be bothered. So but then I realized during that time, like I maybe had made a small stop during that after leaving the PE class, and I found my school bag right next to the swimming center on a staircase that was leading up to a baseball field, or like a finished baseball field. And I think I informed my teacher about this, who was my PE teacher at that been yesterday, and he said, "Oh yeah, I think I remember it was somewhere there," which I think he was lying. And and I found it, and no one had taken it. Like one of the perks of living in a small Finnish town, like they tend to be quite inherently honest in their actions. So if something is lost, it's you can generally count on it. No one's going to steal it, especially it's a school bag. So I found the bag. I looked through it. Everything was there, but like, I had my watercolors there, so had and the bag was wet, so everything had bled through my notes and my um, books and whatnot. So it was quite crummy looking, but it was still there, and I was just the relief was so considerable. And then I went home. It was like around like 4:30 or like 4, and I went. But and then I just remember the ritual. Like I went home. I went to the shower and just like washed all the days of stress away. I put on some better clothes that I had, and then my mom had left, given me kind of like this clandestine, or kind of like this mission of like going to her, that I had to go to her offices after hours and pick an envelope with my name on it, with my sister who had half sister who had just came and had come and picked me up. And I went there, and I found the envelope. It was kind of like breaking and entering situation, which was very on brand for the evening. And the envelope had 40 euros, which was most money I had ever seen during that time. And then we went to the local cinema, got great tickets. I got like the Coke, like the Coke Zero cans for the viewing experience for free, which was, I think, so great. The ticket was a little bit more expensive than normal, but that just added to the experience. And then I just sat down, and my whole world at that time had been literally black and white. Like it was during that year and that place, that time, it was literally black and white. And there was this poetic feeling of the film starting in black and white, and they were giving us kind of like this new, very kind of fresh and interesting and dangerous version of this character. And after the initial like 3 minutes, it like kicks in the gear, and the film, and I felt like my world turned into color. And I was completely raptured. I was because like I had been so tired and kind of so beaten down by the kind of like my worries and my banal worries and my kind of like sense of kind of like powerlessness during those last few days, that this world of great adventure, the world of best food and best drink, the beautiful women, the exotic locations, and this central masculine character who just can make everything fair in the world that he exists in, was absolutely cathartic. It was an absolute kind of like a shot in the arm of like just like wonderful escapism that that I could have hoped for. And yeah, but I saw the film, got back home. My friend came over for a sleepover, and but I think it was a pretty kind of like unsatisfying night for him because the moment I got home, I immediately crashed and went and slept for like like a day and a half after that because I was kind of done for the day. But yeah, that's my. It's a long story, but I think it's a cute story, and I think it's what it makes Casino Royale and I think Bond series in as an extension one of the only film series in my entire life that is kind of like stamped into my DNA. Like I can't see it completely objectively. Like it's just there baked into my being. I'm sorry for the long answer.
No, no, that's great. I know you said you work in the film industry. You could make a little short film about that. 'Cause that's your little mission, isn't it? Or everything that happened before, and get into the Bond, yeah, at the cinema.
Yeah, maybe. And
Does
the
kind of feel like your the origin story.
maybe in a sense, yeah. And I think the reason why it kind of like that story kind of like resonated with me after in the years after was because when I became more aware of the history of the film series and history of the book series, and I found out in my later years, in my adult years, which kind of like I had like this renaissance of Bond fandom in my early adulthood when I came to realize what made Ian Fleming, what inspired Ian Fleming to write this story, and it was, and I just felt like they were kind of like this small but kind of like little elements that made me kind of relate to his experience in writing this character, which was that like he lived in the kind of like the post World War England, which was still kind of like where rations were still at place, and the general kind of gray atmosphere loomed over, and he escaped that by going to the Jamaica every summer. And then when he realized that he had to marry his longtime lover, he kind of like exercised his kind of like fantasies to this character. So it was his way. The writing of those books was his way of kind of like it was his escape. It was his way of kind of like actualize the things that he desired. And I'm just a passive viewer, but I kind of relate to that idea. And to me, it's kind of like if there's like one way to kind of like hone into the idea of like how like the thing about Bond that makes him kind of like how to if there's one way to get the character of Bond and the series of Bond, I think that's a great way to think about it. Like it's an escapist fantasy for a man for like a for an Englishman who is kind of like coming to terms with his own aging and kind of like the banalities of mortality and banality of kind of like family life.
That's great, thank you. Now, my next question was going to be, what is your favourite Bond film? But I think I know the answer, but just confirm for me. What would you say is your favourite Bond film?
Yes, yeah. Well, it's of course it's Casino Royale. I think it kind of has to be, even though if I objectively wouldn't think it's the best in the series, I think it has to be my favorite. I don't think it's a perfect film. I do think it has some kind of like pacing issues, and I think some of the character stuff doesn't quite work. And this is just me saying after like this is just me saying this after like 40 or 50 viewings I've had in the last 15 years. But I think like the reason why I do still kind of like if I would have to argue its merits as a film, I think the reason why I really love it, and I think why it really kind of like is the kind of like the high point of the Craig era, is that I felt that during the Craig era, even though I would say like I like 3 of the 5 films made, and like the other two that I really enjoyed were Skyfall and No Time to Die. I did feel that with those films, given that like the time had because they were so the time between the film releases were so long, it felt like, and also the nostalgia elements kind of crept into the series. It felt like that those 2 other films were very eager to please the audience. It felt like they tried to give everything that the audience might want from this film series, which I think kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a hard thing to kind of like articulate what makes it kind of tough, but it feels kind of mm, I don't want to say desperate, but it feels more laborious. And with Casino Royale, I think it's a film that is made with in absolute confidence. This was during the time when the film series had no reason to be confident. The casting of Craig was very controversial. It was a story that was inherently kind of like low in kind of like high octane action. It was such a departure of the film series at that time. So I'm completely sure that if the producers didn't have that much faith and that much control over the film, and it was like, for example, and there was more authority with some kind of like big studio regarding this film, I'm pretty sure that like the producers would have panicked after the reaction to casting of Craig and would have forced the film to include elements that would pander to the longtime fans. Like we gotta have gadgets, we gotta have like set up jokes, and we gotta have like fantasy and like whatever kind of like this, and they like kind of like make it more like Pierce Brosnan films and whatnot. And the film doesn't do that. It knows exactly what it's trying to do, and it does it very well. Like my favorite portion in the whole series film is the portion between the when Bond goes to Montenegro for the first time. And it starts with Bond meeting Vesper, and then it ends when when the first hand is dealt in the poker game. That's a 14-minute space of time that just breathes. It's just lifestyle. It's just people meeting. It's about drink. It's about locations. It's about banter and whatnot. It doesn't try to kind of. It doesn't try. It's not scared or nervous about its own content. It trusts itself so much, and I think that's the thing that makes that film very special to me. Like it's the sheer confidence and clarity of vision that carries through the whole film.
So you've just talked about your favourite film. So let's look at the polar opposite. What is your worst film?
Yes. Well, I have to maybe. I'm trying to keep my answers maybe a bit shorter, but I'm gonna say like I don't. It kind of changes my kind of like my least favorite kind of changes every now and then. Like I would say maybe like Man with the Golden Gun, I think is generally the worst in the series because I think it has a good villain, but I think it's a kind of like badly paced film. I think it's a film that, unlike Casino Royale, feels very uncertain, insecure in itself. I think it has the worst Bond performance, given the crudeness of Roger Moore's acting, or his characterization of the film, and I have a very kind of like hard time accepting the way the female characters are handled in that film. But but I'm going to say like a film that I think kind of like screws its own premise the worst, and or like it kind of squanders its own potential was Spectre from 2015. And I think it's not like it's the worst film, but I think I think in execution I think leaves a lot to be desired. It's way too long. It's the tension isn't quite there. It feels very paper thin. It feels very rote. And I think like Craig himself, I kind of feel that like they made some kind of miscalculation in how the director and the actor made some miscalculation how to perform the role in that film, because I think people say that like Craig seemed bored in that film. I don't think he was necessarily bored. I think he was trying to channel this kind of general Sean Connery like coolness, but that kind of translated as him being kind of like distant and kind of tired. And also he had like a traumatic knee injury, so that might have done something with that. But I think the main problem with Spectre, why it doesn't really work, is that unlike with No Time to Die, where like Bond dying was like a risk decision, but that didn't fundamental level didn't bother me. I think Spectre is a film that like in its own plot and story is fundamentally kind of wrong, which is the idea of like making Blofeld Bond's brother is a it was a deep miscalculation. First of all, it's essentially lifted from a James Bond parody of Austin Powers 3, but the bigger problem is that it creates it doesn't track it doesn't it doesn't the actions of the character in the present do not feel tangibly connected to anything in the past, because the characters themselves do not really communicate with it, because the Bond and Blofeld themselves don't seem to have any special relationship. It's just said that they have. And also, by doing this and claiming that somehow every single film before the Spectre was kind of like this big plan made by Blofeld to torture Bond. First of all, it doesn't make any sense, and the second of all, it places Bond himself into the center of this universe. Things are happening to him because of who he is. And that's not interesting. And it could be maybe interesting if the reason for Bond being tormented was something that he had done. Like, for example, what if Blofeld was someone that Bond defeated during his military service? And that was kind of like this grudge that kind of like carries over. But him being kind of like this jealous half brother, that has nothing to do with Bond's job or like who he is in the present. It's just kind of, and it just doesn't. It's not. It just doesn't work. I can't really articulate it any better in this situation. But the problem is like it. But the fundamental problem is it places Bond in the middle of this world. Bond is a character who engages in other people's drama and thus becomes a target in those stories. He is not the center of those stories. And even though Bond is a man with the past, he is first and foremost a man of the present, a man of action, performing his duties for the country and whatnot. So I'm not sure like if you understood what I said, but that's kind of like my general problem with the story.
No, it's a great way of putting it. Not something I've thought of myself actually, so it's good to hear an alternate point of view. Certainly one to think about. Let's switch gears just slightly, and we'll talk more around the actors. So obviously six men have taken the official title of James Bond. Who would you say is your favourite of those six?
It's very much a three-way tie between Craig, Connery, and Dalton. And because I would say that like the general through line with those is that I do gravitate towards performers that are closer to Fleming's original creation. And right now I would say that Daniel Craig is third, Sean Connery is second, and the first one is Dalton. And just the reason why I think Dalton maybe edges over the other two is because he's kind of it's kind of a bittersweet kind of situation that because he only did two films, I don't think he ever had the opportunity to go bad with his role. And I think both Sean Connery and Daniel Craig had like missteps in their tenures, which I think kind of like drop their ranking a little bit for me. And I do kind of think like Dalton was the one that felt very much like because like I would say like this, Sean Connery to me is a Bond that like has the energy and this like primordial kind of like feel, but he's not necessarily a dramatic actor or his version of Bond is not that dramatic. He's very much kind of like a lifestyle icon in many ways. And Daniel Craig is very like a dramatic actor. And even though I really like Craig, I do always felt like he's he's one kind of interpretation of Bond, but he's not a quintessential Bond. I think his style and his like look and way he carries himself doesn't make him kind of like he's not the figure I think of when I think of Bond. I think Dalton is the one where these two meet, like a very serious dramatic actor, but also this kind of just kind of way of like visual energy and like way he carries himself, which kind of I think is a perfect combination. And I would say like if there would be any kind of like fantasy of like if history would have went differently in the film series, I think my fantasy Bond film would have been a third Timothy Dalton Bond film, which would have been Dalton's GoldenEye, which I think would have made dramatically much more sense given the post-Cold War world and this betrayal of a former friend and whatnot. But also a special shout out to Toby Stephens, who played Gustav Graves in Die Another Day as the villain. He does a fantastic radio play version of Bond, and I think his voice to me feels very much of like what the novel version of Bond would sound like to me.
So regular listeners of the podcast will know that we talk about our favourite Bond, we rank the films each week, but one of the other things that we also track is the theme song. So Arttu, do you have a particular favourite theme song from the franchise?
we already talked about that Casino Royale is my favorite film and Dalton is my favorite Bond. So I think those two would have to be kind of like recognized in this situation. I think You Know My Name is my favorite song right now, and the second runner up would be maybe The Living Daylights by Aha from the from the film The Living Daylights. I personally always had more gravitate towards more kind of like hard hitting, kind of sharp and elusive and seductive Bond songs, kind of like GoldenEye and whatnot, not the grand romantic epics of that like I don't know For Your Eyes Only would be or something like that, or even Skyfall. And but if we like but then like if we want to stretch the definition of what makes true what makes a Bond song, I think the best Bond song, which I the most the song that I most consistently listen to, is The Look of Love by Dusty Springfield, because it was recorded for the Casino Royale parody film from 1967. And that's a really kind of smooth and pleasant song for for like a Saturday evening like right now. And I also want to shout out the Bond 25 Royal Philharmonic Orchestra recording, which I think have made like fantastic renditions of like a lesser Bond songs like Die Another Day and Another Way to Die. I think, for example, I think Die Another Day is just fantastic in when it's kind of like adapted to these symphonic stylings, and it was according to Spotify, it was my I don't know top 20 most listened song last year.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I must admit, The Look of Love by Dusty Springfield, I had no idea that was recorded for Casino Royale of 1967. So I feel like I've been educated on this podcast. So thank you for that. We're going to switch gears again. To Jay's point, we like to talk about various aspects of the Bond franchise. We can't talk James Bond without talking Bond girls. So who would you say is your favourite of all the Bond girls that have been?
I think my top three generally is the conventional favorites in the for many of the fans. It would be Tracy DiVincenzo from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Vesper Lynd from Casino Royale, and Natalia Simeonova from GoldenEye. From those three, I would say Natalia Simeonova is my favorite, and the reason is that even though like Vesper and Tracy are very interesting and very strong characters played by fantastic actors, Eva Green and Diana Rigg. I think the reason why I don't want to pick those as my favorites is because they they are great Bond ladies. I like to use the word lady, but they're great Bond ladies, but they're kind of designed to be those. Like they are supposed to be the very kind of quintessential Bond falls in love with these women kind of characters, and I always feel like that kind of shifts the way we are supposed to see them in the films. Simeonova, I think, is he's more in the she's more in the vein of what traditionally Bond girls are like. But I think GoldenEye really pushes and finds interesting ways to explore how the sometimes very limited character of Bond girl or Bond lady can be used. Like she has her own backstory, her own adventures, her own motivations that brings him into clash with Bond in around like halfway point when they meet for the first time. And I think, and also Isabella Scorupco is a wonderfully beautiful woman, but I feel like, unlike with someone like Denise Richards, I actually believe Natalia as this kind of like computer engineer character, like and so on forth, so forth. I think Scorupco has this kind of almost like a Jodie Foster quality where she seems so inherently intelligent that makes him very interesting. And I would think that Natalia would be in the future of the Bond films, especially because I think there's a greater push to give more agency and more room for female characters in the film series in the future. I think Natalia is maybe a good blueprint to think about in the future films, because how strong he feels as a character while also fulfilling a very kind of more kind of like conventional role of a Bond lady in a Bond film.
That's great. And listeners, if you want to see where we ranked Natalia, Tracy, and Vesper, you have to make sure you listen to the main podcast. So, moving on, you've talked about your favourite Bond girl / Bond lady. Do you have a favourite villain? So this could be a main villain or a henchman.
Yeah, let me think quickly. In general, I would say it's a close toss-up between Telly Savalas's version of Blofeld from On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Le Chiffre from Casino Royale. I think Savalas is one of those actors that has this unique capacity to make his dialogue sing. I think he was like theatrically trained actor, and so he's a fantastic orator. Like it would have been interesting to see like a film with Timothy Dalton and Savalas in the same film because they are both kind of like I think they come from somewhat similar backgrounds as like when it comes to acting training and whatnot. And I think he's the best Blofeld of all that have come, and I think he's also I think maybe the closest maybe to how Blofeld is in the books, but a book Blofeld is kind of I think a different beast, and some ways the film and some ways the novel version is more compelling, and some ways the film version is more compelling. I would say for example that Savalas's version of Blofeld in On Her Majesty's Secret Service is better character, better villain than Blofeld is in the On Her Majesty's Secret Service book. And the second one I would say is Le Chiffre. And the reason for and I think why Liz Schiffer really works is because I think first of all Mads Mikkelsen is one of the best actors of working today. Like he has this magnetic energy to him, where like he has this fantastic capacity to be very menacing, but also he has this very underlying vulnerability to him. And I really enjoy that. Like he does make. I think at least for me, I think the viewing experience of Casino Royale is a little bit complicated because we want Bond to win, for example, the poker game and whatnot. But when Le Chiffre loses, I think it's not that triumphant of a moment. First of all, of course, we know that the film is still going on, but there is this feeling of like this guy is so screwed right now. And I think that quality, and also I think that's the great thing about the Casino Royale film and the book, is that it feels like Bond and Le Chiffre themselves both are kind of like mirror images of each other. They are both kind of agents of some kind of like power structure. Like Le Chiffre is this unknown, is the this middle manager of this unknown organization, and Bond is this assassin from On Her Majesty's government, and they are both coming to terms in the film with the fact that they are both disposable. And they kind of like, and Le Chiffre's problem, his tragic flaw is that he overplays his own hand, forfeiting his own life. And Bond does that all the time in that film also. Like he puts himself in the situations where he doesn't think, he just does without being willing to understand that like his government is going to maybe kind of like throw him aside if the situation warrants it. So I think they have this wonderful duality with each other. And also I want to say as a kind of honorary mention, I think Fiona Volpe and Emilio Largo from Thunderball, I think make a fantastic pairing. I don't think neither of those characters are very deep, but they have a very strong sense of presence and this presentation, like with Largo being very, I think, a classic Bond villain with the eye patch and ring, and Luciana Paluzzi as Volpe being probably the most beautiful woman that has ever lived. So while also being this kind of like very unsentimental, kind of like this sharp villainess, and those are really fun. So yeah, I would say like there's this one villain that is like awe-inspiring in his authority. Second one which is more kind of like makes you feel conflicted in his vulnerability, and this and in the third place these two, Volpe and Largo, because they are just fun. So.
Thank you for that. That's a quite the selection of villains, and from a range of Bond eras as well. So that covers a lot of ground. Now, another thing that Jay and I like to talk about when on the main pod are our favourite scenes from each of the films. Memorable scenes throughout the franchise there have been. What would you say are a few of your more memorable scenes from the 25 films we've had so far?
Oh yeah. Well, I have five. Let's say five. So I'm gonna quickly go through them. My number five, which I think is a collection of scenes, is like a portion of film. It's from the film The Living Daylights, which is the extraction sequence of like when Bond is extracting Koskov was like the from the east to the west, because well, first of all, it's a quite close adaptation from the short story The Living Daylights, and I think it's really fun that they made a film where like the starting point is the short story and they expand it to something else. I think to me that's kind of like the purest form of Bond that I really enjoy, when he's kind of like this in the shadows, kind of lurking Cold War character who is kind of like who transitions from a tuxedo. Like to me, like one of the great kind of like quintessential Bond situations is from that scene when he's in a tuxedo and then goes into a hotel, and then like you realize that the collar of the tuxedo is Velcro, and it's just like obscures his neck so he can do the sniper kind of like a sniper kind of like guarding situation after that, right after that. And yeah, I think that's like one of the great Bond scenes to me, absolutely. Number four, I would say, is Bond versus Grant in From Russia with Love, the train scene, because I personally think like even though Bond is known for the very high explosive action, I've always liked it most when Bond is in close quarters situations, like fighting to the death with someone else, because I think that kind of, first of all, like even though Bond is not realistic at all, that feels more most tangible of like what this kind of man in this kind of job would do. And there is this kind of like, and it kind of it's they're very intense. You really want Bond to win, but also there is this knowledge of like this situation won't end unless either one of these two are dead, which I think kind of places the viewer into Bond's perspective more than any other scene when he's like really struggling and is very close to buying it, and then of course finds a way to get away from that. And also that scene, I think it's a great fight scene because I don't think it's very well choreographed, but it's not too choreographed. It feels very kind of burly and kind of messy, and also the sound is fantastic with the screeching trains and the smoke, of course, in the visuals and whatnot. And number three, I would say, is the opening scene from Goldfinger. If I would have to show a scene from a Bond film to someone who has never seen a Bond film, I think that would be my pick, just because it has everything. Bond is kind of like doing this kind of like a clandestine sabotage mission, like going from the water and like sneaking into a facility, exploding it, and kind of like getting rid of his wetsuit. There's a like tuxedo behind, a tuxedo under it, and then like goes into a bar and then makes out with a girl, but is targeted by assassination and whatnot. So I think it's a perfect small Bond film. And then I would say is probably number two would be again in the vein of what with Bond versus Grant is Bond versus Kaufman, Dr. Kaufman in Tomorrow Never Dies, the hotel room scene, because I think I think is the best scene in the whole of Brosnan films, which I think is kind of weirdly telling because the films themselves kind of got really loud and really kind of bombastic, and that kind of small scene between those two characters is my favorite because because it reveals something about Bond's character that we very rarely see, which is that like there is this darkness to him, like he is like his like Bond is a heroic character in a very Greek way, meaning that he's not a heroic in terms of virtue. He's heroic in terms of competence, and he is defined by his ability or and willingness to kill an unarmed man, for example, in a situation. And I think that's a quintessential scene regarding that. I think it's like I would say like Pierce Brosnan is one of those Bond actors that is the furthest away from Fleming's creation, aside from that scene, and maybe a few others. But I would say that's very much a Fleming scene. And my number one scene is from Casino Royale when Bond has killed. I think Malacca was the character's no Malacca was the free runner. Like, but he kills the Ugandan warlord, and then kind of goes to the bathroom and cleans himself up by kind of like washing himself and getting the drink and whatnot. Because I think that's one of the great character revealing moments of Bond. It makes him very human, and also it kind of informs the kind of like the inner dialogue, the inner world that Bond has, because the novels have very much in the novels Bond has lots of internal dialogue, which you can't really translate to screen. But that's a scene where it kind of works, where like it kind of speaks to the idea of like why does Bond kind of like go from woman to woman. Why he likes to drink. Why he likes to drink so heavily. Why does he gamble so much? It's him kind of like because he's a man who lives on the edge of his. I like to quote Dalton. He lives on the edge of his life very much. Like, and that's his resting pulse, being on the kind of life's edge all the time, which is kind of makes him a character who kind of is always at the kind of like in a state of some kind of fight or flight, where he has to use these vices to kind of subdue himself. And but at the same time, it's also something that kind of like makes him push himself more and more to the limit. So in that sense, I would say, for example, and a side note, if I would have to pick any character from any film outside of Bond films that remind me of what I think Bond is as a person, it would be Jeremy Renner's character from the film The Hurt Locker, because it's a war film about a man who is kind of struggling with stresses of war, but instead of becoming PTSD and panicked by it, he becomes addicted to it, and like he can't live outside this state of battle. And I think Bond has this same kind of neuroses, and I don't know. It's just something that it's that kind of meaning that I latch onto that scene, for example, like him kind of coming to terms with the sheer stress and darkness and extremity of his life, and also how it might be very beautiful, but it's not warm, it's not safe, and it's very alienating and lonely.
Yeah, there's some great scenes there, and one of the ones I think sticks out for me is the Bond versus Red Grant, and I know we talked about that quite a bit, Andy, didn't we, in one of our, obviously, from Russia with Love episode.
Yeah, very, very memorable scene from the Connery era.
So, moving on, we talk about the gadgets, and Andy's something you actually talk about in each of the episodes in terms of the different gadgets Bond uses. So, do you have any particular favourites from the franchise, Arttu?
I would say that, like, in general, my rule of thumb is that, like, the more subtle, the better. Like something that could actually be given to a spy, even in this fantasy world. So I would maybe say that my top three right now would be the wrist dart for Moonraker. Like for a film that is very fantastic, I think it has one of the more kind of subtle and interesting gadgets, which I think is the dart gun inside the sleeve, which shoots when Bond kind of like uh, ex, ex when Bond opens his hand and the pulse from his hand kind of like shoots it out. It's great. And on the same vein, I would say the rocket cigarette from You Only Live Twice is fun, and where like Bond smokes like lights up a cigarette, and it actually has a small rocket that he can use as a gun. But I would say that my favorite gadget of all time is the suitcase from the attaché case from the film From Russia with Love, because the just like the sheer applicability of it all, like it's a suitcase, but it has a knife that's very easily opened. It has gold sovereigns, which I think is something that Bond should always have, at least in the older films. Like if he gets stuck somewhere where like he has no support network or whatnot, gold sovereigns is a great way to buy some favors. And the anti-burglary system that like with the tear gas canister, and I think from all of those things, I think the small sniper rifle that is inside the case is probably the cherry on top. Like I think it's a fantastic piece, and I would love to see something akin to that in the future Bond film, like him kind of like building himself kind of like this weapon apparatus from kind of smaller things that are easy to hide, because those are things that really do exist in nowadays also, but it also harkens back to like Second World War, where like Sten guns were very popular with kind of like a special like SOE forces and whatnot, because it was very easy to break into small pieces.
Yeah, some great gadgets there. I mean, particularly the attaché case from Russia with Love is a particular favourite of mine as well. Now, there's over the 60 years plus of Bond now, there's been various high points, but there's also been one or two low points as well. What would you say are some of the low points of the franchise?
Yes. So, well, we already talked about the Brofeld thing regarding Spectre, so I'm not going to go over that again. But I think still that I think that was that was a miscalculation that hurt No Time to Die, and I think it was kind of a horrible act or like horrible decision or like that in the series because Spectre and Blofeld were so long, something that the Eon Productions couldn't touch, and when they could, they screwed it up. So it's kind of sad. But I would say that maybe the weakest time period in the series to me was between 1971 and 1974, which included Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and Man with the Golden Gun. The reason is because I think something happened after 1969 and the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, because that's a film that has great legs. Like it has been kind of reinterpreted and like reevaluated as a classic and in the Bond series, and it's a film that has influenced future Bond films so much, and it has such strong elements and a strong sense of confidence in terms of style, in terms of casting, in terms of set design and whatnot. But it wasn't a success when it came out. Lazenby wasn't that well received, and the film didn't produce that much. It was like I think it was like the second lowest grossing Bond film to come out at that time, and also Lazenby didn't want to continue and whatnot. So the series went in this mad scramble to essentially get back the audiences and keep the series going, which meant that they had to bring back Connery for Diamonds Are Forever, and which worked to varying results. I think Diamonds Are Forever is one of the worst Bond films, and but then he left after that, and they had to find one new Bond again, and Roger Moore came in and whatnot. And the thing with Roger was that like they didn't really know what to do with him before Spy Who Loved Me, where they made a conscious decision to reinvent what his version of Bond is, which was softer and more kind of like funny and kind of gentlemanly, while he was much more of a kind of like a rogue, a bastard in the Live and Let Die and Man with the Golden Gun. So they didn't really know what to do with him. So to reiterate, Sean Connery was kind of had like a weak last entry in the official series, and Roger Moore they didn't really know what to do with Roger Moore in the first two films, and also because On Her Majesty's Secret Service had been such a flop, the film series at that point really started leaning into trends of like what's popular at that time, because Bond film series started to seem passé. So with Diamonds Are Forever, it didn't necessarily emulate a certain style, but bringing it to America was a clear kind of attempt to cater to American audiences. And with Live and Let Die, they did a blaxploitation film, which granted I think is a very kind of inspired idea if you try to adapt a book that is so as problematic as Live and Let Die, which is kind of with very racist overtones. Which so I think it was smart to try to make it into a blaxploitation film, but it was very much a outsider's perspective on the series, on the genre of films, and also Bond himself is kind of redesigned in that with his style, with his clothing style, and this gun choice into a character that he was not. Like his turtleneck and shoulder holster design was essentially Steve McQueen from Bullet, and he had changed his gun from PPK to Magnum 44 for 44 Magnum, which was Dirty Harry's gun, which had come out in 1971. So the idea of like Bond had essentially become a passé thing, and it was kind of like it felt like it was like a old guy who was still trying to feel relevant during that time. So which I think led to at that time very successful films. Diamonds and Live and Let Die were very successful films, but I think those films don't kind of I think they have soured in my mind very heavily because they feel embarrassed of what they are. And Man with the Golden Gun continues in this vein because it was trying to do the Bruce Lee action films of the early 70s and whatnot. And also I think that was a film where Bond's character was the most cruel, most inconsiderate and crude character, which he could be in the novels. But even in the novels, especially the way he acts towards women, in the novels, even though he was crude and the character has, I think, a bit of a sadomasochistic bent and kind of like this misogynistic attitudes in the novels, he generally was kind of very kind of nurturing and kind of understanding and whatnot. And Roger Moore's version of Bond in that film, Man with the Golden Gun, isn't even that. He's very unlikable, even as almost a villainous way. And so those things were really bad. The insecurity the series seemed to have regarding itself and their inability to hone down who Bond's character is in the early 70s. And in addition to that, the way the female characters are handled in those films, where I feel like that, but in the from the feminist lens, Bond series, I don't think has had a simple trajectory towards progress because I usually like to break the treatment of female characters in the Bond series into two columns. How strong is the character, and how does the film treat the character? As in, like the character might have like strengths and kind of like they can be very compelling, but if Bond, for example, is kind of questionable in his in the actions, or like or if the film kind of like has this very passe cruelty, or and so I or if the film has this very callous cruelty towards the characters, that's one other thing. And I think like Sean Connery's films had very much a situation where they had very strong female characters like Honey Rider, Tatiana Romanova, I think is very compelling, and like Pussy Galore and Domino Derval and Fiona Volpe. Uh, but they might they were very strong characters, but I think they had maybe some kind of like crude treatment regarding them. And sometimes in the later Bond films, the Bond girl could be very kind of vapid and dull and vapid or one-dimensional and kind of like just a helpless scream queen. But he could get some. But the film itself treats the character with compassion, with loss. And the example of that would be Tanya Roberts in The View to a Kill. I think in 71 to 74, there was like worst of both worlds, especially with like Live and Let Die, Man with the World Golden Gun. The women themselves were kind of weak characters and they were treated very badly. So I think that kind of creates this a very kind of like ugly, gives a very kind of ugly feel to those few films. Sorry, I got maybe a bit political, but I think this is a kind of important subject to bring up regarding Bond series.
We in the main podcast we talk about some of the one-liners and quotes in each of the films. So, do you have any particular quotes that stick out or one-liners from the franchise?
Well, yeah, I think like I've always liked when the quotes are kind of smart, but also kind of sardonic and dark. Like when they're really silly, I kind of find them a little bit out of character. So I think I think Thunderball has two very good ones with the Bond killing the guy with the harpoon and say, "Well, I think you got a point." Or the and also my favorite quote from that film is probably when Bond and Fiona have slept together and like they are heading out and the Bond opens the door and the goons are there, so he closes it immediately to kind of secure the situation, but realizing that Volpe is actually pointing a gun at him, he just says, "Oh, friends of yours," and then opens the door and come in. Listen, like that's a fantastically funny line. And then I think Casino Royale, the line "the last hand nearly killed me" is really fun after Bond has been poisoned. And and also from No Time to Die, which is I think a film that I'm a big proponent of. I think the line that Bond says to Safin, which is that all you really do, the line that Bond says to Safin, which is all you're really doing is standing on a very long line of angry little men. I think it's a fantastic line because it feels very much like a Fleming line. Like Fleming was someone who kind of liked to take the piss out of characters that were kind of like megalomaniac in their actions, like Doctor No or Blofeld. So I think that's a very much a line that would exist, I think, in a Fleming novel. And regarding I think a quintessential line regarding Bond's kind of like darker aspects was from the aforementioned Tomorrow Never Dies scene between Bond and Kaufman, where Bond is kind of like turning Kaufman's gun into his forehead, and Kaufman is pleading with line like pleading with the line, "I'm just a professional doing a job," and Bond just says "me too," and then shoots him to death. Like I think that's a very much a quintessential Bond scene, Bond line to me.
Indeed, thank you for those. So, you've mentioned a few times throughout the pod the novels. So, my next question is going to be: have you read any of the Bond novels, or how many of the Bond novels have you read?
Well, yeah, I've read or at least once all of the actual novels from Ian Fleming, which I think was 14, and with two short stories. I don't think I've read all the short stories all the way through. But I've kind of like but I've read all of them at least once. But like my memory is a bit foggy maybe with some of them because because time has passed since. But I every now and then I do skim them. For example, I did skim like You Only Live Twice and for On Her Majesty's Secret Service for uh, this specific podcast, just to fact check myself. Although I wouldn't be surprised if the listeners would want to fact check my facts afterwards in some cases. But I would say I have read the Fleming novels and I've read few other like materials like the official autobiography of 007, which I think is a interesting exercise in meta narratives and has some interesting ideas, but in the end is kind of needlessly complicated and kind of pointless. And aside from that, I've read mostly the Dynamite comics that have come out since 2015.
So I was going to ask you about who should be the next Bond, but I know previously we've discussed this off air, and you said you're not really fussed, but you're happy to talk about some of the side characters more, which we can pick up later on in the podcast, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just to like reiterate, like I just like the whole discussion it between about like who should be next Bond is so fervent right now, but it's so kind of like I feel so saturated by that question, so I'm just not interested in discussing it, like or like adding to it because I don't have any information or necessarily an insight to give regarding this.
No, that's a fair point. And there'll always be people who'll say it's the wrong choice, regardless of who's in charge. It's one of those you'll never please all of the people all of the time. But I will ask you one more question just before we then move on to our rankings. And this may touch on some points you've made earlier, but is there any particular film that you were looking forward to more than the others? And did it meet your expectations?
Well, yeah, like I would say, like since Casino Royale, I've been very excited for every Bond film that have come after, come after that, and I would say, like in general, I would say Skyfall, I think, was almost like a euphoric experience when it came out for the first time. But it wasn't like was I really excited about. I was very excited about it, but I kind of wasn't quite prepared for what it gave and I was very pleased with what it gave. I was quite emotional at the end of the film, and on the flip side of that, after Skyfall, when Spectre was announced, like I was like hugely excited when the title was released and the cast was released, and like Sam Mendes coming back and whatnot. Like it should work, but it didn't work. I would say like Spectre to me wasn't like a massive horrible disappointment, but like that feeling when you've seen like I don't know Phantom Menace in 1999, where like you were very excited about it, but then you see it and there's this like sinking feeling in your stomach that something isn't right. And I feel like I for the last like few years I feel like I've been in this abusive relationship with that film Spectre because I've tried to like it so much, but it just doesn't work. So that's probably my kind of like those are the two. Like Skyfall, very excited, and it was absolutely kind of like taken aback with what I got as and from the heels of that, I was very excited for Spectre, and that didn't work. And so that's the kind of the dramatic shifts I've had in the last few years.
So, moving on swiftly, we've got the rankings now for a number of different areas that myself and Andy are monitoring in the main season of the podcast. So, kicking us off, Arttu, what are your top 5 Bond films? And obviously, you've mentioned Casino Royale already.
Yes, well, right now I would say it's maybe number 5 is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Number 4 is Skyfall. Number 3 is The Living Daylights. Number 2 is From Russia with Love, and number 1 is Casino Royale. Like I would generally say, like there's a great variety there, but I would say like the carrying theme is that like I prefer more kind of like the more grounded, more kind of like kind of sharp, more serious, and kind of like brutal films in the series. And which in that vein, I would probably have to say that honorable mention to License to Kill, but it's not on this top five. But yeah, those five would be my picks right now.
Great stuff. Moving on to Bond girls or Bond ladies. Do you have a top five from the franchise?
Yes, well, I think I've been very kind of like candid already about my top three, but like right now it would be Tatiana Romanova from Russia with Love. Number four would be Fiona Volpe, which I think which is from Thunderball. But I think like of course she's a character that could very well exist in the villain category also, and I would like to recognize that. And then number three is Teresa Di Vincenzo, Tracy Bond. I think she's a fantastic character. I think the character itself is kind of maybe creaky in a way, like how she's utilized in the film, but it's remedied by the fantastic performance by Diana Rigg. And then number two is Vesper Lind, and number one is Natalia Simeonova.
So you've mentioned earlier on about your favourite villain is Blofeld from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. What are your other top five? What are your other villains in terms of to make your top five from the franchise? This could be primary villain or henchman.
So the number five right now would be Franz Sanchez from License to Kill. Granted, I do kind of feel that it's the character is maybe a little bit out of place in a Bond's world because he's a Pablo Escobar pastiche, and the film itself is very kind of like Lethal Weapon style. But that's the history of Bond films. Is like they are very good at adapting trends of the time. But he's very compelling. I think Robert Darby, despite his very kind of tough to swallow political views, I think is a very underrated actor. And number four would be Emilio Largo, and I would like to place Fiona Volpe in connection to that because I think they are kind of like a really fun duo that have I think those characters, while they are not necessarily that detailed or like they are not that deep, the casting carries so much of the weight, and that I'm very happy about that. And I would consider Emilio Largo to me to be the not a quintessential Bond villain, but kind of like a prototype that of like where which I think like if I would have to picture a Bond villain in my mind, I would probably think of him in the classical sense. Number three would be right now Raul Silva from Skyfall because I think the I was very taken by the kind of like the demented qualities that he had, which I think makes him because he's many times compared to Alec Trevelyan from GoldenEye, but I think Silva is more interesting because he has this kind of like broken psychology in him that is very kind of fascinating. And Le Chiffre is number two, and number one is Telly Savalas' version of Blofeld.
Let's talk about Bond actors again. So you mentioned earlier kind of your favourite, but we've had six that have taken up the mantle. How would you rank them? 1 to 6 or 6 to 1?
Well, yeah, I'm going to go from 6 to 1. Well, number six is George Lazenby, but I think he's by default. Like he was another professional actor who was placed in this role and was kind of like a little bit kind of feeling his way through the role, which he immediately abandoned. So he's kind of there's not much material to work from. But I don't think he's awful. I think he wasn't a standout. But I don't think. But the other elements are so strong in that film that it kind of carries all the boats. The same tide carried all the boats. Number five, I think, is Pierce Brosnan. Sorry for every other '90s kid out there, but I do think that even though he looks like he was designed in a lab to look like Bond, like he very much looks like the what novel version of the character is. I've always thought that Brosnan to me is the perfect Bond in the same way that the faceless brand merchandising icon of Bond is in the Heineken bottles. Like he looks the part, and whatnot, but there's no true character there to work with. And because I think because he never found a way, and the scripts I think are at fault, but I think he never found a way to really to actually make the character his own. But I also think that's partially because of his own disinterest in the novel version of the of Bond, because he said that he read maybe Casino Royale but felt like it didn't give him much to work with. And aside and in comparison to Craig and Dalton, who very much talked about or very much were about the novel version, if you watch Pierce Brosnan's interviews, he seems to just talk about watching Goldfinger in 1964 when he came from Ireland and saw the first colored film, and he said that like he was essentially informed by Connery and Roger Moore, and he was trying to find kind of like this middle ground between them, which I think sacrificed his own style. Or it sacrificed his own opportunity to create his own version of the character. Roger Moore then comes number 4, and that's because like he's a character which I think is quite far away from what Fleming had created, but in his own terms, Moore is fantastically charismatic and really fun to watch. Uh, the first 2 films notwithstanding. And then right now, number 3 would be Daniel Craig. Number 2 would be Sean Connery, and number 1 would be Timothy Dalton.
So, last question in terms of rankings. You mentioned earlier in the episode that you currently like You Know My Name and The Living Daylight. So do you just want to confirm what is your top favourite Bond theme songs?
Yes. Right now, I would probably say number 5 is License to Kill. Like I said, that I don't like necessarily the more grand and romantic Bond songs, but if you listen to the lyrics of License to Kill, it's actually a song about a psychotic stalker. So it has this very kind of interesting view to it. Number 4 is A View to a Kill, a Duran Duran song. It's just great. And number 3 is Goldeneye. Like I said, I like more seductive kind of like snake-like songs. And number 2 is You Know My Name, which I think is a very great kind of like distillation of what the Bond from that film feels like. And also, I would love to see like a rock song again as a Bond song. Like I would love to have like Arctic Monkeys doing a song in the future. And the first one right now is Living Daylights, with a special shout out to the Living Daylights, the second song in Living Daylights, which is Where Has Everybody Gone from the Pretenders, which is really fun rock song also.
Thank you for that. That brings to the end our rankings piece. But before we let you go, just a few things we wanted to chat about. So, as we're recording this, we're not that far removed from Bond's 60th anniversary. And I understand you did something pretty special to celebrate that. Why don't you tell the listeners what it is that you did?
Yeah, so yeah, indeed, like last year was the 60th anniversary, and in general, like I had a very kind of a pretty eventful 60th in terms of Bond, because the my year started with me releasing my 1 hour long documentary or essay about the history of Bond's films, or rather how Bond films have reflected the history of the times that they were produced in, starting from the novels up until No Time to Die. And when that was done and like year went on, me and my friend decided that we would love, and actually I decided for my friend that we should have like a proper Bond celebration. Like I was the super fan, but he was kind of like a fan also, and a fan also who liked to try like new things and whatnot. So I decided that I wanted to have a Bond evening where we would kind of try things from the novels and kind of like just spice our life up with little Bond lifestyle. And the idea was this: that we went to his place, which was this kind of like large flat, and our viewing we had like viewing program, which was first the documentary about the history of Bond music that came from Amazon, and then there was the recording from the Royal Albert Hall concert that was made for the 60th. So that was those were the 2 pieces that we had, and the third one would be a Bond film of our choice. So we made that as our viewing plan, and we spiced that up with food and like drink, because the thing is that like Bond in its earliest forms, when it came to like what was the escapism that Bond books offered, it was travel and food and drink. So we kind of, those are the things that we kind of recreate in this time and place. in this kind of like cold Arctic early winter winter in Finland. So what we did was I created a menu because I'm a bit of an amateur cook. I really like making food and whatnot. So what we did that we made a menu of kind of like snacks, and the snacks included few types of cheese, like brie cheese and blue cheese, and with crackers and so on and so forth, with like fig jam and whatnot. And then we had martinis. I bought myself a shaker and and all the ingredients from the original novel, or as close as they could be nowadays, which means like Gordon's gin, vodka. We used Smirnoff vodka because we want to use a Russian vodka, and some kind of Russian vodka. But Russian vodka, understandably, is right now in short supply for good reasons. But Smirnoff was one thing that we could find, and Lillet Blanc, which is the closest thing to Quina Lillet, or Cocha, or maybe Americano, but like that's a debate for another time. And then we got glasses and lemon peel, and we made drinks for ourselves, and like had drank like six of those during that evening, and ate those things. And also the big kind of like centerpiece of our snack table was at first a lumpfish roe and actual caviar. And neither of us had eaten caviar before. So that was kind of like this great experience of us like doing the thing of like putting it in our mouth and like pressing it into the roof of our mouths and just like letting the bubbles explode. And that was kind of like my great experiences of this year. Just that in this context of this series, we managed to kind of like create this very novel culinary experience for both of us, and especially for him because he's not as much of a foodie as I am. And he was very happy about that. And after that, we also had like our main dish was like roast potatoes and honey glazed carrots and medium rare steaks for both of us with like glasses of red wine and whatnot. So we did all of those. We ate, we drank so many martinis, and also made like vodka soda and whatnot like that. And and then after seeing those two pieces, we decided eventually to watch Skyfall together, and that was a fantastic experience right there. And we continued our party for the next day because we had so much alcohol to go through, and it was great. And in the end, like I just talked with my friend just before coming here, and he said like the caviar was that was the great experience of the last of that evening. And I think he did award me for my for my evening planning by giving me as a Christmas present, which was the Lego version of Aston Martin, which was a very sweet thing for him to do. So not the really expensive one, the cheaper one, but still, it was very nice of him. So that was the thing, like, and I think that's the theme that we are excited to continue with other films, like creating menus, films, and like watching pieces from pieces that we know that we really enjoy. So yeah, that was our 60th celebration.
Nice one. Andy, have you had caviar before?
Never in my life. I'm not sure I've even seen caviar or been in the same room as it, to be honest.
No, I've had fish and chips today, but that's the closest I think
The
I've got.
caviar is quite expensive, yeah. So it's a bit of a treat, but I really implore to anyone to eat it. Like those listening who are wondering what caviar tastes like, if you have eaten fish roe, it doesn't taste. At least to me, it doesn't taste anything like it. It tastes like creamy spinach. Like it's a very kind of strange flavor. Then to me, like which we both found just really delightful.
No, that's really interesting, and it's nice that you celebrated the 60th anniversary in that way with your friend.
Thank you, Arttu. That's been really interesting, and we'll obviously post links to that YouTube video that you've mentioned. It's been great talking to you today, and check out more specials coming up soon with more Bond superfans. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll speak to you soon.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to the Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.